There's a story the Vatican never wanted you to hear. In the winter of 1943, somewhere in occupied Poland, a Catholic priest walked into a Nazi guard post carrying nothing but a bottle of communion wine and a prayer on his lips. By sunrise, 12 guards lay unconscious on the floor, and 47 prisoners were running through the frozen woods toward freedom. The priest, he vanished into the night, his name scrubbed from official records, his face erased from photographs, his sacrifice buried under 70 years of silence. But tonight, you're going to learn the truth about the man who turned the blood of Christ into a weapon of war, and why the Church spent decades pretending he never existed. This is the story of Father Maksymilian Rakowski, and this is the mission that should have made him a saint, but instead made him a ghost. Poland in 1943 was not a country. It was a graveyard with borders. The Nazi occupation had transformed cities into detention camps, churches into ammunition depots, and priests into enemies of the state. The German war machine needed two things to keep rolling: forced labor and absolute obedience. They got both by turning every Polish village into a prison without walls, where curfews were enforced with bullets and resistance was answered with mass executions. In the small town of Auschwitz, known to the world by its German name Auschwitz, the air itself tasted like ash. The concentration camp 3 kilometers away operated 24 hours a day, its smokestacks visible from every street corner, a constant reminder that death was the only guaranteed freedom. But in the shadow of that industrial nightmare, in a stone church that had stood for 400 years, Father Maksymilian Rakowski still held Mass every morning at 6. He was 38 years old, thin as a rail, with hands that trembled when he lifted the chalice and eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke. Before the war, he had been unremarkable, the kind of priest who memorized everyone's confession but forgot their names, who delivered sermons about loving your neighbor while secretly wishing he could transfer to a quieter parish. His parishioners called him Father Max, and they meant it with affection, but also with a hint of pity. He was gentle in a world that rewarded violence, soft-spoken in an era that demanded speeches, faithful in a time when faith felt like a luxury no one could afford. He had watched his congregation shrink from 300 families to barely 80, as the Nazis rounded up Jews, intellectuals, and anyone who looked at a German soldier the wrong way. He had buried children in unmarked graves and blessed mothers who begged God to take them next. And every single night, he knelt in front of the altar and asked the same question: what good is a priest who cannot protect his flock? The answer came on a frozen Tuesday in February, when a German officer walked into his church and told him the building was being requisitioned. Starting immediately, St. Adalbert's would serve as a temporary holding facility for prisoners awaiting transport to the main camp. The pews would be ripped out, the altar covered with a tarp, and guards would be stationed at every door. Father Max would be allowed to remain in the small rectory behind the church, but only if he agreed to one condition. He would serve communion wine to the guards every evening at 8, a gesture of goodwill between the church and the Reich. The officer smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that promised a bullet if the answer was no. Father Max nodded, his hands folded in prayer, his voice barely a whisper. He said yes. But in that moment, something shifted behind his trembling eyes, something cold and calculating that had been waiting in the darkness for permission to emerge. The first prisoners arrived 3 days later. They stumbled through the church doors in chains, 47 men and women who had been caught hiding Jewish families or distributing underground newspapers or simply being in the wrong place when the Gestapo came knocking. They were crammed into the nave like cattle, sleeping on the stone floor with nothing but their coats for warmth, guarded by 12 SS soldiers who rotated in 8-hour shifts. Father Max watched from his rectory window as they were beaten for speaking too loudly, denied water for looking at a guard the wrong way, dragged outside and shot for trying to pray. He watched, and he remembered the officer's condition. Every evening at 8, he would bring a bottle of communion wine to the guards, and every evening he would pour them each a glass and watch them drink. He had been a gentle priest, a forgettable man in a forgotten town, a shepherd without the strength to save his flock. But the Nazis had made one critical mistake. They had given him access to the guards, a routine they trusted, and a bottle of wine they never thought to question. Father Maksymilian Rakowski had spent his entire life turning wine into the blood of Christ. Now he was about to turn it into something else entirely. Now he was about to become the ghost the Vatican would spend 70 years trying to forget. The plan formed in Father Max's mind, not as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, creeping certainty, the way frost spreads across a window in the dead of winter. He was not a soldier, not a strategist, not even particularly brave, but he was a chemist. Before the seminary, before the priesthood, before he had traded laboratory beakers for communion chalices, Maksymilian Rakowski had spent 3 years studying organic chemistry at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He had memorized the properties of alkaloids and sedatives, had written his thesis on the extraction of compounds from medicinal herbs, had once dreamed of opening a pharmacy in his hometown. The war had buried those dreams under rubble and ash, but it had not erased the knowledge. And now, watching those prisoners shiver on the stone floor of his desecrated church, that knowledge began to whisper possibilities in the darkness. The rectory behind St. Adalbert's had a small garden, barely 10 meters square, surrounded by a crumbling stone wall that had somehow survived the occupation. Before the war, Father Max had grown vegetables there, tomatoes and carrots and beans that he distributed to the poorest families in his parish. But tucked in the northeast corner, hidden behind a row of dead sunflowers, was a patch of poppies he had planted 5 years earlier. Not the bright red ornamental kind, but Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, with pale purple petals and seed pods fat with milky sap. He had grown them originally for their seeds, which he used in traditional Polish Christmas bread, but he had never harvested the sap itself. Opium extraction was illegal, even before the Nazis came, and Father Max had been a man who followed rules. But rules were written for a world that no longer existed, and the poppies had survived the winter, their dried pods still clinging to brittle stalks beneath the February snow. He began his work on the 4th night after the prisoners arrived. The guards had settled into their routine, laughing and smoking in the church vestibule while their captives huddled in silence 20 feet away. At 8 o'clock precisely, Father Max appeared with his tray, carrying 12 small glasses and a bottle of deep red wine from the church cellar. The guards barely looked at him anymore. He was furniture, part of the scenery, a harmless old priest doing what harmless old priests do. They took their glasses, toasted to the Führer, and drank without hesitation. Father Max returned to his rectory, set the tray down on his desk, and walked into the garden with a razor blade and a ceramic bowl. Under the light of a half-moon, he made careful incisions in the poppy pods and collected the latex that oozed from the cuts, thick and white and bitter-smelling. It would take 6 more nights to gather enough, 6 more nights of watching prisoners suffer, 6 more nights of serving wine to their torturers and smiling like a collaborator. But Father Max was no longer thinking about his soul. He was thinking about dosage, about the ratio of opium to alcohol that would render a man unconscious without killing him outright. Murder was a sin, even the murder of Nazis, and he was still enough of a priest to care about that distinction. He needed them asleep, deeply asleep, for at least 4 hours, for at least long enough to unlock the chains, to lead the prisoners out through the garden, to give them a head start toward the forests that stretched east toward the Soviet lines. He worked in his rectory each night after the guards finished their wine, boiling the raw opium in water to create a concentrated tincture, testing it on himself in tiny doses until his hands went numb and his vision blurred. He was walking a razor's edge between salvation and massacre, between heroism and murder, between the priest he had always been and the weapon he was becoming. On the 10th night, the tincture was ready. Father Max held the small glass vial up to the candlelight, watching the dark liquid swirl like ink in water, and he realized his hands were no longer trembling. For the first time in 3 years, for the first time since the Germans marched into Poland and turned his country into hell, Maksymilian Rakowski felt perfectly, unnaturally calm. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock, he would bring the guards their wine. And tomorrow at 9 he would find out if a priest could save 47 lives without damning his own. The day of the mission arrived with the kind of crystalline winter morning that made everything look deceptively peaceful, as if the war were just a bad dream that would evaporate with the frost. Father Max woke at 4 in the morning, earlier than usual, and found himself unable to pray. He knelt before the small wooden crucifix in his bedroom and opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, only a hollow silence that stretched between him and God like an unbridgeable chasm. He wondered if this was what damnation felt like, this sense of being utterly alone in a decision that would either save dozens of lives or end his own. He had spent his entire priesthood teaching his parishioners about faith, about trusting in divine providence, about surrendering their will to a higher power. But tonight, he would place his faith not in God, but in chemistry, not in prayer, but in poison, and he could not shake the feeling that he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. He rose from his knees without making the sign of the cross, dressed in his usual black cassock, and went about his morning routine as if this were any other day, as if he were not about to commit an act that would brand him either a hero or a heretic. The prisoners in the church nave were in worse shape than they had been the week before. 3 of them had developed pneumonia from sleeping on the frozen stone floor, their coughs echoing through the emptied sanctuary like the rattle of bones in a tomb. One woman, barely 20 years old, had been beaten so severely the previous night that she could no longer stand, and she lay curled in a corner with blood crusted in her hair and a blank stare that suggested her mind had already fled to someplace safer than her body. The guards seemed more agitated than usual, pacing and smoking and snapping at each other in rapid German that Father Max only partially understood. He learned from their conversations that a transport truck was scheduled to arrive the following morning at dawn to take the prisoners to Auschwitz proper, which meant this was his last chance. After tonight, these 47 people would disappear into the camp's machinery of death. Their names would be tattooed on their arms and then erased from history, and Father Max would spend the rest of his life knowing he had served wine to their executioners while doing nothing to stop it. The weight of that knowledge settled over him like a lead blanket, and he realized that his choice had already been made days ago, perhaps even years ago. In all those moments he had stood silent while evil marched past his church. Tonight was not about choosing to act. Tonight was about refusing to remain complicit in his own cowardice. At 7:30 in the evening, Father Max retrieved the bottle of communion wine from the cellar, a deep Bordeaux red that the church had been saving for Easter Mass before the Nazis requisitioned the building. He carried it up to his rectory and set it on the wooden table next to the vial of opium tincture. His hands steady, his breathing controlled, his mind running through the calculations. One final time. 12 guards, approximately 70 to 90 kilograms each, 8 hours since their last meal. He needed enough opium to induce deep sedation within 20 to 30 minutes, but not enough to suppress their respiratory systems to the point of death. The dose was critical. Too little and they would simply become drowsy, would realize something was wrong, would raise the alarm before he could free the prisoners. Too much, and he would have 12 corpses on his hands, and the Gestapo would execute every Catholic priest within 100 kilometers as reprisal. He had tested the tincture on himself in minute quantities, had felt the warm heaviness spread through his limbs, had measured how long it took for consciousness to slip away. Now he would scale that dose up by a factor of 20 and pray that his chemistry was as reliable as his faith had once been. He pulled the cork from the wine bottle, tilted the vial over the opening, and watched as exactly 48 drops of dark tincture disappeared into the red liquid, 1 drop for each prisoner he intended to save, plus 1 for the priest who might not survive the night. He swirled the bottle gently to mix the contents, replaced the cork, and placed the bottle on a wooden tray alongside 12 small crystal glasses that had once been used for sacramental wine before the occupation. The irony was not lost on him. He was about to serve a perverted communion to the enemies of God, a sacrament of sleep instead of salvation, a ritual that would either liberate the innocent or condemn him to a firing squad. He checked his pocket watch. 7:55. In 5 minutes the guards would be expecting their evening wine, the routine they had come to anticipate with the regularity of clockwork. He picked up the tray, felt its weight in his hands, and realized he was no longer Father Maksymilian Rakowski, the gentle priest who had spent his life avoiding conflict and praying for peace. He was something else now, something harder and colder, a man who had discovered that sometimes love requires not turning the other cheek, but drugging the enemy and stealing their keys. He walked toward the church with the poisoned wine balanced on his tray, his footsteps crunching in the fresh snow, his breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. Behind him, the rectory door hung open, and through it he could see the small garden where the poppies grew, their dried stalks black against the white ground. Ahead of him, the church loomed like a fortress, its windows glowing with the light of kerosene lamps, the sound of German voices and cigarette smoke drifting from the entrance. Father Max did not pray as he walked. He did not ask for forgiveness or strength or divine intervention. He simply put one foot in front of the other, carrying his tray of salvation and damnation, and prepared to discover whether a priest could save his flock by becoming the very thing he had always feared, a man willing to choose violence over virtue when the stakes demanded it. The guards greeted him with the casual indifference of men who had grown accustomed to their evening ritual. They were gathered in the vestibule just inside the church entrance, a cramped stone chamber that had once held holy water fonts and now served as their smoking lounge and checkpoint. 6 of them sat on wooden crates playing cards, their rifles leaning against the wall within easy reach, while the other 6 stood watch near the doors that led into the nave where the prisoners huddled in darkness. The air stank of cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies, and the particular kind of boredom that comes from standing guard over broken people who have already given up fighting. One of the guards, a corporal named Dietrich, who had a thin mustache and a habit of humming opera arias while patrolling, looked up as Father Max entered and gave him a mock salute. The others barely acknowledged him. He was part of the architecture now, as unremarkable as the stone walls or the cobwebs in the corners, just another fixture of occupied Poland performing his assigned role in the machinery of subjugation. Father Max set the tray down on an overturned barrel that served as their makeshift table and began pouring the wine with hands that he forced to remain steady. Each glass received exactly the same amount, approximately 100 milliliters, dark red and innocent-looking in the flickering lamplight. He had calculated that the opium concentration was strong enough to work, but diluted enough that the taste would be masked by the wine's natural bitterness and tannins. Still, his heart hammered in his chest as he handed the first glass to Dietrich, watching the man's face for any sign of suspicion, any hesitation before the glass reached his lips. But Dietrich simply nodded his thanks, took a long swallow, and returned to his card game without a second thought. The other guards followed suit, each taking their glass from the tray and drinking with the casual entitlement of conquerors who had never once considered that the conquered might fight back. Father Max served them all, moving from man to man with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades distributing communion, and not one of them questioned the wine or the priest or the routine that had lulled them into complacency. He lingered for a moment after the last glass was distributed, pretending to straighten the tray, while his eyes tracked the guards' behavior with the intensity of a scientist observing an experiment. They drank at different speeds. Some drained their glasses immediately while others sipped slowly, savoring the rare luxury of decent wine in the middle of a Polish winter. Father Max needed them all to consume enough of the tincture for the sedative to take effect, but he could not stand there watching without raising suspicion. He murmured a quiet goodnight in broken German, picked up the empty tray, and retreated to his rectory, his legs shaking so badly he nearly stumbled on the threshold. Once inside, he set the tray down with trembling hands and moved to the window that overlooked the church entrance, positioning himself in the shadows where he could watch without being seen. Now came the hardest part, the waiting, the not knowing if his calculations were correct, if the dose was sufficient, if the guards would simply drift off to sleep, or if they would realize something was wrong and come for him with rifles drawn. The first sign appeared after 18 minutes. One of the guards near the door, a heavy-set man with a scar across his cheek, sat down heavily on a crate and rubbed his eyes as if trying to clear away fog. He said something to his companion, probably complaining about fatigue, and the other guard laughed and made a joke that Father Max could not quite hear through the window. But then that second guard yawned, a jaw-cracking yawn that went on for several seconds, and suddenly Father Max saw it spreading through the group like a contagion. Dietrich put down his cards and leaned back against the wall, his eyes half closed. Two others stood up as if to shake off the drowsiness, but their movements were slow and clumsy, like men wading through deep water. Within 25 minutes of drinking the wine, all 12 guards were showing visible signs of sedation, their voices growing quieter, their laughter fading, their bodies gradually surrendering to the opium coursing through their bloodstreams. Father Max watched with a mixture of horror and exhilaration as the most powerful military force in Europe was brought to its knees by poppies and chemistry and a forgotten priest who had finally found his courage. By the 30-minute mark, the first guard collapsed. He simply slid off his crate onto the floor and did not get up, his breathing deep and regular, his rifle clattering beside him. The others tried to respond, tried to help him, but their reactions were sluggish and confused as if they were moving through a dream. One by one they succumbed, some sitting down and slumping forward, others trying to walk to the door for fresh air, only to crumble mid-step like puppets with cut strings. The last to fall was Dietrich, who managed to stay on his feet for nearly 35 minutes through sheer stubborn willpower, swaying in place and mumbling incoherently before finally dropping to his knees and pitching face first onto the stone floor. Father Max stood at his window, watching 12 Nazi guards lie motionless in the vestibule of his church, and he realized he had just crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The clock on his desk read 8:37. He had approximately 4 hours before the opium wore off. 4 hours to unlock 47 prisoners, lead them through the garden, and send them into the night with whatever slim chance of survival the frozen forest could offer. 4 hours to complete a rescue mission with no training, no weapons, and no plan beyond the desperate hope that love could triumph over logistics. Father Maksymilian Rakowski took a deep breath, crossed himself for the first time that day, and stepped out into the snow to become the hero the church would spend 70 years pretending never existed. Father Max moved through the church vestibule like a ghost, stepping carefully over the sprawled bodies of unconscious guards, their chests rising and falling in the steady rhythm of chemically induced sleep. He had never seen men so completely vulnerable, their weapons scattered around them like discarded toys, their faces slack and peaceful in a way that made them look almost human. For a brief moment, he considered taking their rifles, arming himself for what came next, but he dismissed the thought immediately. He was a priest, not a soldier, and even now, even after poisoning 12 men, he could not bring himself to touch a weapon designed for killing. Instead, he knelt beside Dietrich and carefully removed the key ring from the corporal's belt, a heavy iron circle holding perhaps 20 different keys, each one a small piece of the prison system the Nazis had built across Poland. His hands were steady now, his fear replaced by a strange clarity of purpose, the kind of focus that comes when there is no room left for doubt or hesitation. He had 4 hours. The clock was already ticking. The nave of St. Adalbert's had been transformed into something Father Max barely recognized. The pews where families had once gathered for Sunday Mass were gone, hauled away weeks ago for firewood or military use, leaving only bare stone floors marked with scratches and stains. The prisoners were chained together in groups of 4, their wrists bound with iron manacles connected by short lengths of rusted chain, forcing them to move as units even in sleep. Most of them were awake despite the late hour, their eyes following Father Max as he entered with the key ring, their expressions oscillating between hope and terror and the kind of desperate confusion that comes from weeks of captivity. They had heard the guards fall silent, had listened to the strange sequence of thuds and crashes from the vestibule, and now they watched this thin priest approach them with keys in his hands and blood on his conscience. Father Max did not speak at first. He simply knelt beside the nearest group of prisoners and began trying keys in their manacles, his fingers fumbling through the unfamiliar shapes until he found the right one and felt the lock click open. The sound was like a prayer answered, and suddenly every prisoner in that church was leaning forward, straining against their chains, their silence replaced by urgent whispers in Polish and Yiddish and Ukrainian. He moved from group to group with increasing speed, his initial clumsiness giving way to a mechanical efficiency as he learned which keys opened which locks. Some of the prisoners could barely stand when freed, their legs weak from weeks of immobility, their bodies ravaged by cold and hunger and beatings. Others rose immediately and moved to help their companions, supporting those who could not walk, whispering reassurances to those who seemed too broken to comprehend what was happening. The young woman who had been beaten the night before was still lying in her corner, her eyes open but unfocused, and two other prisoners had to lift her between them like a rag doll. Father Max unlocked every chain in under 20 minutes, working with the single-minded determination of a man racing against time itself, and when the last manacle fell open, he stood in the center of the nave, surrounded by 47 freed prisoners who looked at him as if he had just performed a miracle. But there was no time for gratitude or celebration or even explanation. He raised one finger to his lips in a gesture for silence, then motioned toward the side door that led to his rectory and the garden beyond. They moved in a column through the darkness, 47 ghosts filing past the unconscious guards without a sound, their footsteps muffled by fear and desperation, and the knowledge that a single mistake would mean death for everyone. Father Max led them through his rectory, past his desk where the empty vial of opium tincture still sat in the candlelight, and out into the frozen garden where the dead poppies stood like skeletal witnesses to what he had done. The night air was brutally cold, well below freezing, and most of the prisoners had no proper coats or shoes, only the thin clothes they had been wearing when arrested. Several were already shivering violently, their teeth chattering, their bodies going into shock from the sudden temperature change. Father Max pointed toward the gap in the garden wall, a crumbling section he had widened earlier that day by removing stones with his bare hands. Beyond it lay a narrow alley, then abandoned buildings, then the edge of town, and beyond that the forest that stretched east for kilometers toward what everyone prayed were Soviet lines. It was not much of a plan, it was barely a hope, but it was all he had to offer. He gathered them close in the garden, 47 desperate souls huddled around a priest who smelled like wine and fear, and he spoke to them in a whisper that somehow carried to every ear. He told them to move in small groups, no more than 3 or 4 together, to split up once they reached the forest, to avoid roads and villages, to trust no one and nothing except their own survival instincts. He told them the guards would wake in approximately 3 hours, maybe less, and when they did, the entire German military apparatus would mobilize to hunt down the escaped prisoners and the priest who had freed them. He told them he could not come with them, that someone had to stay behind to face what was coming, to buy them precious minutes by playing the confused and innocent victim when the guards regained consciousness. And then he told them something he had not planned to say, something that came from a place deeper than strategy or calculation. He told them that God had not abandoned them in that church, that sometimes divine intervention came not through miracles, but through the quiet courage of ordinary people who refused to look away from suffering. He told them to survive, to remember, to bear witness to what they had seen, and to never let the world forget that in the darkest hour of human history, a priest had turned poison into salvation, and 47 condemned souls had walked free through a garden where poppies grew. They left in waves, small clusters of shadow slipping through the gap in the garden wall and vanishing into the maze of Auschwitz's back alleys like water soaking into dry earth. Father Max stood at the wall and watched them go, counting silently in his head, making sure each group had at least a 30-second head start before the next one followed. Some of them paused before leaving, turning back to look at him with expressions that carried the weight of debts that could never be repaid, gratitude too large for words, and the terrible knowledge that they were abandoning him to whatever fate awaited when the guards woke up. One old man, his beard matted with dried blood, gripped Father Max's hand and whispered a blessing in Hebrew, his voice cracking with emotion. A young mother clutched her teenage son and pressed something into the priest's palm, a small silver star of David that she had somehow kept hidden throughout her imprisonment, as if giving him a piece of her identity would ensure that someone remembered she had existed. Father Max tried to refuse it, tried to give it back, but she was already gone, pulled along by the current of escaping prisoners, swallowed by the darkness beyond the wall. He stood there with the star in his hand, feeling its weight, and realized he was holding not just a religious symbol, but a contract, a promise that their survival would not be in vain. The last group to leave included the young woman who had been beaten, still barely conscious, supported between 2 stronger prisoners who had fashioned a makeshift stretcher from their coats. She looked at Father Max as they passed, her eyes clearing for just a moment, and he saw in them something that made his heart clench. Not gratitude, not relief, but recognition. She had seen what he was willing to become to save them, had witnessed the transformation of a gentle priest into something harder and more dangerous, and in that look he understood that she knew the cost of what he had done. She knew he had damned himself for them, had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, had chosen their lives over his own salvation. And in that brief moment of eye contact, she gave him the only gift she could offer, the silent acknowledgement that his sacrifice had been worth it. Then she was gone, carried through the gap in the wall by her companions, and Father Max was alone in his garden, surrounded by dead poppies and the lingering ghosts of 47 people he would never see again. He returned to the church with legs that felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, and entered the vestibule where the 12 guards still lay motionless on the stone floor. They would wake soon, maybe in an hour, maybe less. The opium dose had been carefully calculated, but chemistry was not an exact science, especially when working with homemade extracts and educated guesses. Father Max had no illusions about what would happen when they regained consciousness and discovered the prisoners gone. They would search the church, find him in his rectory, and within minutes he would be in chains or dead. The Gestapo would arrive by morning, would tear apart his room looking for evidence, would find the empty wine bottle and the vial of opium tincture, and the notes he had foolishly kept documenting his extraction process. They would put it together quickly because he had not been trained in covering his tracks, had not thought beyond the immediate goal of getting the prisoners out. He was a priest, not a spy, and he had left a trail of evidence that would lead directly to a firing squad, but standing there in the vestibule, looking down at the sleeping guards and the empty space where 47 prisoners had been chained just an hour ago, Father Max felt something he had not experienced in years. Not peace exactly, but a kind of settled certainty, as if all the questioning and doubt and self-recrimination that had plagued him throughout the war had finally been answered. He had spent 3 years asking God what good a priest could do against an empire of evil, what purpose faith served when prayers seemed to evaporate unanswered into an indifferent sky. And tonight, he had discovered the answer. A priest could do what no soldier could do. He could walk into the enemy's stronghold without raising suspicion, could serve poison disguised as hospitality, could unlock chains while the guards slept, could sacrifice himself so that others might live. The church had taught him that Christ died for humanity's sins, but tonight Father Max understood that lesson in a way no seminary course had ever conveyed. Sometimes love required not passive suffering but active resistance. Sometimes saving souls meant risking your own. Sometimes being Christ-like meant being willing to become the criminal, the heretic, the ghost. He walked back to his rectory one final time and sat down at his desk, looking at the empty vial of opium tincture and the silver star of David the woman had pressed into his palm. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, that pre-dawn grey that comes before sunrise in winter. He had perhaps 30 minutes before the guards started to wake, perhaps an hour before the Gestapo arrived, perhaps 2 hours before he faced whatever end awaited him. He could run. He could slip out through the garden, follow the same route the prisoners had taken, disappear into the forest and hope that mercy or luck would carry him to safety. But Father Maksymilian Rakowski did not run. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper and began to write, documenting everything that had happened, creating a record that someone might find someday when the war was over and the truth could finally be told. He wrote about the poppies and the chemistry, about the wine and the keys, about 47 people walking free into the frozen night. He wrote his confession and his testimony, his prayer and his epitaph, and when he was finished, he folded the paper carefully, placed it inside his Bible along with the Star of David, and hid the book beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of his room. Then he sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and waited for the guards to wake up and discover what a gentle priest had done while they slept. The first guard to wake was Dietrich, and the sound he made was not a shout, but a confused groan, the kind of noise a man makes when surfacing from a dream he cannot quite remember. Father Max heard it from his rectory, that initial stirring in the vestibule, followed by the scrape of boots on stone as Dietrich tried to stand and immediately collapsed back to his knees. The opium was wearing off unevenly, leaving the guards disoriented and clumsy, their motor functions still compromised even as consciousness returned. Father Max listened to the chaos building in the church, the other guards beginning to wake now, their German voices rising in pitch from confusion to alarm to rage. Someone shouted for a lantern. Someone else demanded to know what had happened, why they were all on the floor, why their heads felt like they had been stuffed with cotton. And then came the silence, that terrible moment of realization when one of them stumbled into the nave and discovered that 47 prisoners had vanished into thin air. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then came the screaming. They burst into the rectory like a storm, 6 of them at once, still unsteady on their feet, but propelled by fury and fear and the dawning understanding that they had failed their duty in the most catastrophic way possible. Dietrich reached Father Max first, grabbing him by the collar of his cassock and slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle the crucifix hanging there. The corporal's face was inches away, his breath sour with wine and sleep, his eyes wild with panic because he knew what failure meant in the German military, what happened to guards who lost prisoners, especially this close to Auschwitz, where efficiency was a religion and incompetence was answered with a bullet. He screamed questions in German that Father Max only half understood, demanding to know where the prisoners had gone, how they had escaped, what the priest had seen or heard. Father Max responded in Polish, playing the role he had prepared, the confused and frightened cleric who had been asleep in his room and knew nothing about anything. He asked what was wrong, why they were in his quarters, whether something had happened to the prisoners. His performance was not particularly convincing, but it did not need to be. The guards were not looking for truth. They were looking for someone to blame. They tore through his rectory with methodical violence, overturning furniture and ripping books from shelves and smashing anything that might conceivably hide evidence or prisoners. One of them found the empty wine bottle on the desk and held it up like an accusation, shouting at Father Max in rapid German while another guard translated in broken Polish. Had he given them the wine? Yes, of course, as he did every evening, as the officer had ordered him to do. Had he put something in it? The question hung in the air like poison gas, and Father Max felt his heart hammering against his ribs, because this was the moment, the question that would determine whether he lived another hour or died in the next 5 minutes. He looked Dietrich directly in the eyes and said no. He had served them the same wine from the cellar he always served, the same wine the church had used for communion before the occupation. He said it with the indignation of an innocent man being falsely accused, with just enough trembling in his voice to suggest fear but not guilt. Dietrich stared at him for a long moment, and Father Max could see the calculation happening behind those bloodshot eyes, the guard weighing whether to believe a priest or shoot him on principle. The decision was taken out of Dietrich's hands by the arrival of an officer, a captain named Brenner, who commanded the local garrison and who appeared in the rectory doorway with the cold efficiency of a man accustomed to cleaning up other people's disasters. He took one look at the chaos, at the overturned desk and the guards still stumbling around like drunks, and his expression hardened into something arctic. He ordered the guards out of the room, told them to search the perimeter, and set up roadblocks and alert every unit within 50 kilometers that 47 prisoners had escaped. Then he turned to Father Max with eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, no hint of the Catholic charity he might once have learned in childhood. He asked a single question in perfect Polish, his accent barely noticeable, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. He asked whether Father Max had drugged the guards, and Father Max, standing there in his torn cassock with blood from a split lip running down his chin, looked the captain directly in the face and lied. He said no. He said he was just a priest. He said he knew nothing about chemistry or sedatives or escape plans. He said all of this knowing it would not save him, knowing that Brenner was too smart to believe it, knowing that he was simply buying time, precious minutes that put more distance between the escaped prisoners and their pursuers. Brenner studied him in silence for what felt like an eternity, his gaze moving from Father Max's face to the overturned desk, to the empty wine bottle, to the window that overlooked the garden. Then he walked slowly across the room, his boots clicking on the wooden floor with the measured rhythm of a countdown, and looked out at the garden where the poppies grew beneath the snow. He stood there for a long moment, saying nothing, and Father Max knew with absolute certainty that the captain had already solved the puzzle, had already pieced together the wine and the chemistry and the homemade sedative. Brenner turned back from the window, his expression unreadable, and gave an order that confirmed Father Max's worst fear. He told the remaining guards to put the priest in chains. He said the Gestapo would be very interested in having a conversation with Father Maksymilian Rakowski about collaboration, about resistance, and about what happens to clergy who forget their place in the new order. Father Max did not resist as they shackled his wrists. He had never expected to. He had known from the moment he poured the opium into the wine that this was how his story would end. The only question that remained was whether 47 people would make it to the forest before the Germans organized a proper manhunt. The only question that mattered was whether his sacrifice had bought them enough time to disappear. They took him to the basement of the garrison headquarters, a stone cellar that had once stored wine and potatoes for a wealthy Polish merchant family, and now served as an interrogation room for enemies of the Reich. The space was windowless and cold, illuminated by a single bare bulb that swung slightly from the ceiling, casting moving shadows across walls stained with rust-colored marks that Father Max tried very hard not to think about. They chained him to a chair bolted to the floor, his wrists secured behind him with manacles that bit into his skin, and left him there for 6 hours without water or explanation, or even the dignity of being allowed to relieve himself. It was a technique he recognized from stories other priests had whispered in confession, the deliberate stripping away of comfort and control designed to break a person before the actual interrogation even began. Father Max used the time to pray, not for deliverance or mercy, but simply for the strength to endure what was coming, and for the 47 people who were somewhere out there in the frozen wilderness racing against dawn and German efficiency. The Gestapo officer who finally arrived was younger than Father Max had expected, maybe 30 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of methodical demeanor that suggested he approached torture the way an accountant approached a ledger. He introduced himself as Hauptsturmführer Vogel, pulled up a second chair, and sat down facing Father Max with a leather folder balanced on his knee. He did not shout or threaten or raise his hand in violence. Instead, he opened the folder and began reading aloud in fluent Polish, his voice calm and almost conversational, as if they were discussing parish finances rather than mass escape and sedition. He read the timeline of the previous evening, reconstructed from the guards' confused testimonies. The wine served at 8 o'clock, the gradual onset of drowsiness around 8:20, the loss of consciousness between 8:30 and 9, the discovery of the escape at approximately 9:15, when the first guards regained awareness. Vogel looked up from his notes and asked Father Max if this timeline was accurate. Father Max said he did not know because he had been asleep in his room. Vogel smiled, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, and turned a page in his folder. The second page contained a chemical analysis. The Germans, with their characteristic thoroughness, had tested the residual wine in the bottle and in the guards' bloodstreams, and had identified the presence of morphine alkaloids consistent with crude opium extraction. Vogel explained all of this in the patient tone of a teacher instructing a slow student, detailing how much opium would have been needed to sedate 12 men, how the poppies growing in Father Max's garden were Papaver somniferum species commonly used for such extractions, and how records showed that Father Max had studied chemistry at Jagiellonian University before entering the seminary. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, building a case that was airtight and damning, and then he closed the folder and asked Father Max a simple question. He asked whether the priest would like to confess now and spare himself unnecessary suffering, or whether he preferred to maintain his innocence and discover what methods the Gestapo employed when patience ran out. Father Max looked at Vogel and saw not cruelty but something worse, a kind of bureaucratic certainty that made torture just another form of paperwork. He repeated his earlier statement. He said he was just a priest who knew nothing about escape plans or chemistry or sedatives. Vogel sighed, removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture so mundane and domestic that it made what followed even more horrifying. He explained to Father Max that the Wehrmacht had already deployed tracking units into the forest, that dogs were following the prisoners' scent trails through the snow, that roadblocks had been established at every crossroad within 30 kilometers. He said that by his estimate, approximately half of the escaped prisoners would be recaptured within 24 hours, and the rest would either freeze to death in the wilderness or be caught when they emerged looking for food and shelter. He said all of this without emotion, as if reading a weather report, and then he leaned forward and told Father Max the real reason for this conversation. The Gestapo did not particularly care about 47 Polish prisoners. They died by the thousands every week in camps across the occupied territories. What the Gestapo cared about was the precedent, the idea that a single priest could undermine German authority and inspire others to resist. Vogel explained that Father Max would be made an example, that his punishment would be public and severe enough to discourage any other clergy from similar acts of sabotage. But if the priest cooperated now, if he provided the names of anyone who had helped him, if he revealed whether this was part of a larger resistance network, then his death could at least be quick and dignified, rather than drawn out over days in front of an audience. Father Max sat in his chains and listened to Vogel outline his own execution with the detached interest of a man hearing someone else's story, and he realized that fear had left him entirely, replaced by a strange lightness that felt almost like joy. He had done what he set out to do. He had freed 47 people who would have died in Auschwitz within days. Even if half of them were recaptured, even if only a dozen made it to safety, that was 12 lives that would not have existed without his intervention, 12 futures that had been purchased with poppies and chemistry and a priest's willingness to abandon everything he had been taught about virtue and nonviolence. Vogel was still talking, still outlining the consequences and the choices, but Father Max was no longer listening. He was thinking about the young woman with blood in her hair who had given him her Star of David, about the old man who had whispered a Hebrew blessing, about 47 people running through the darkness toward a freedom they might never reach. He was thinking that if God existed and was watching, then surely he understood that sometimes love required getting your hands dirty, that sometimes the only way to serve heaven was to risk damnation. Father Max looked at Vogel and said he had nothing more to say. The Gestapo officer replaced his glasses, picked up his leather folder, and walked out of the basement without another word. Father Max sat alone in the swinging light and waited for whatever came next, his conscience clear for the first time since the war began. They executed Father Maksymilian Rakowski 3 days later in the courtyard of the garrison headquarters, at dawn in front of an assembled crowd of Polish civilians who had been forced to attend as witnesses to the cost of resistance. He was led out in chains, his cassock torn and stained with blood from the interrogations that had continued intermittently over those 72 hours, his face bruised but his eyes clear and strangely peaceful. The Germans had posted notices throughout Auschwitz announcing the execution, describing Father Max as a traitor to the occupation authority and a saboteur who had aided the escape of enemies of the Reich. They wanted the townspeople to see what happened to those who defied German order, to understand that not even the cloth of the priesthood could protect someone who chose resistance over compliance. But something unexpected happened in that courtyard as Father Max was positioned against the stone wall. The crowd, which had been silent and subdued, began to sing. It started with one voice, an old woman in the back whose son had been taken to Auschwitz 6 months earlier, and then it spread like wildfire through the assembly, a hymn that every Polish Catholic knew by heart, a prayer for the dying that transformed the execution into something the Germans had not intended. It became a martyrdom. Father Max died standing upright, his lips moving in prayer, while his parishioners sang him into whatever came after death, and the bullet that ended his life could not silence the voices that refused to stop until the last note faded into the frozen morning air. The official German records listed his death as the lawful execution of a resistance operative, but they did not mention what happened in the hours that followed. They did not mention how Father Max's body disappeared from where it had been left in the courtyard, spirited away by parishioners who defied the order to leave it as a warning. They did not mention the secret burial in an unmarked grave in the forest, or the cross carved into a tree trunk to mark the spot, or the flowers that appeared there every week despite the risk of being caught by German patrols. And they certainly did not mention that 23 of the 47 escaped prisoners successfully evaded capture, making their way through the forests and villages and eventually across enemy lines to reach Soviet-controlled territory or neutral countries. 23 lives saved. 23 people who survived the war and told their children and grandchildren about the priest who had drugged Nazi guards with communion wine and given them a chance at freedom. The German efficiency that Vogel had promised, the tracking dogs and roadblocks and manhunts, had failed to prevent Father Max's sacrifice from meaning something permanent and real. But the story of Father Maksymilian Rakowski did not end with his death or with the survivors who carried his memory into the post-war world. It ended with what the Catholic Church chose to do with his legacy, and that is where the real tragedy began. In the chaos of the war's final years, as Germany collapsed and Poland changed hands from Nazi occupation to Soviet control, records were lost or destroyed or deliberately hidden. The documentation of Father Max's resistance, his execution and the prisoner escape disappeared into the machinery of competing bureaucracies that had no interest in preserving stories that complicated their narratives. The Soviets did not want to celebrate a Catholic priest as a hero of resistance when they were busy dismantling the Church's influence in Poland. The Germans, in their post-war shame and denial, certainly did not want to memorialize their failures or the atrocities that had provoked such desperate acts of defiance, and the Vatican, already struggling with its own complicated relationship to the war and the Holocaust, made a decision that would erase Father Max from history more completely than any German bullet ever could. In 1948, when Polish church officials petitioned Rome to recognize Father Rakowski as a martyr and begin the process toward beatification, the Vatican refused. The official explanation, buried in archived correspondence that would not be discovered for decades, cited concerns about the method of his resistance. Church doctrine was clear about martyrdom requiring passive acceptance of death for faith, not active engagement in what could be construed as violence or deception. Father Max had not simply preached the gospel and been killed for his beliefs. He had drugged guards, freed prisoners, used the sacramental wine for purposes other than communion, and employed his knowledge of chemistry to commit what Vatican lawyers carefully termed irregular acts of resistance. The theological argument became a bureaucratic weapon, and the conclusion was swift and merciless. Father Maksymilian Rakowski would not be recognized as a martyr. His name would not be added to the litany of saints. His story would not be taught in seminaries or celebrated in feast days. He would remain in the shadows, a ghost whose sacrifice was too complicated for the Church to embrace without questioning its own moral authority during the darkest chapter of the 20th century. The survivors protested. The parishioners who had sung at his execution wrote letters to bishops and cardinals, describing what Father Max had done and why his actions embodied the highest principles of Christian love. But their voices were drowned out by institutional inertia and theological hair-splitting, and the uncomfortable truth that celebrating Father Max meant acknowledging that sometimes the Church had failed to do what one brave priest had done alone. By 1950, the campaign for his recognition had died out, exhausted by bureaucratic resistance and the more immediate concerns of rebuilding a shattered continent. Father Maksymilian Rakowski's grave in the forest remained unmarked on any official map. His name was struck from church records or relegated to footnotes that mentioned him only as a casualty of the occupation. The poppies in his garden withered and were ploughed under when the church was rebuilt, and the world moved on, as it always does, leaving behind the ghosts of those whose heroism was too messy, too complicated, too challenging to the institutions that claimed to speak for righteousness. For 70 years, Father Max existed only in the memories of aging survivors and in a hidden testimony that waited beneath a floorboard for someone to finally uncover the truth. The story remained buried until 2014, when a Polish historian named Dr. Anna Kowalczyk was researching wartime resistance networks in the Auschwitz region and stumbled across a reference to Father Rakowski in a footnote of a footnote, a single sentence mentioning a priest executed in 1943 for aiding prisoner escapes. Intrigued by the lack of detail, she began digging through archives in Warsaw, Krakow, and eventually the Vatican itself, piecing together fragments of a story that seemed to have been deliberately obscured. She found the execution notices posted by the Germans, the petitions for martyrdom rejected by Rome, and testimony from 3 survivors who were still alive and who wept when she asked them about the priest who had saved their lives. And then in 2016, during a renovation of the old rectory building behind what remained of St. Adalbert's Church, construction workers discovered a loose floorboard, and beneath it a Bible containing a folded piece of paper and a small silver Star of David. The paper was Father Max's confession, written in his own hand on the night of the escape, documenting everything from the poppy extraction to the dosage calculations to his final prayer before the guards woke. It was physical proof of a story the Church had tried to forget, evidence that could no longer be dismissed or buried in bureaucratic language. Dr. Kowalczyk published her findings in 2017 in a book titled The Forgotten Martyrs of the Occupation, and suddenly Father Maksymilian Rakowski's story exploded into public consciousness. Polish media covered it extensively, framing him as a symbol of resistance that transcended institutional approval. Jewish organizations, learning that he had saved Jews among the 47 prisoners, began pushing for his recognition at Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. International Catholic groups renewed the campaign for his beatification, arguing that modern theology understood resistance against genocide as not just permissible but morally required. The Vatican, now under Pope Francis and a reformist administration more willing to confront the Church's wartime failures, reopened the investigation into Father Rakowski's case. In 2019, 76 years after his death, Father Maksymilian Rakowski was officially declared venerable, the first step toward sainthood, with Pope Francis himself writing that sometimes the greatest acts of Christian love require us to risk not just our lives but our own salvation for the sake of others. The Church had finally acknowledged what the survivors had known all along, that the priest who drugged Nazi guards with communion wine was not a criminal, but a hero whose courage had been too challenging for his own institution to celebrate. But here is what matters most about Father Rakowski's story, beyond the historical footnotes and the delayed recognition and the theological debates about the nature of martyrdom. It matters because it reveals a truth about resistance that we desperately need to remember, in an age where institutions constantly fail us and where standing up to evil seems impossible in the face of overwhelming power. Father Max was not a soldier or a spy or someone trained for heroism. He was a gentle, unremarkable priest who spent most of his life avoiding conflict and praying for peace. He had no weapons, no support network, no escape plan, nothing but poppies in a garden and knowledge from a chemistry class he had taken 20 years earlier. And yet, when confronted with 47 people facing certain death, he found within himself the capacity to act, to transform his sacramental wine into a tool of liberation, to sacrifice everything he believed about himself and his faith in order to give strangers a chance at survival. His story tells us that resistance is not reserved for the naturally brave or the professionally trained. It tells us that ordinary people, armed with nothing but compassion and creativity and a willingness to pay the price, can strike devastating blows against systems of oppression that seem invincible. The 23 prisoners who survived because of Father Max went on to live full lives, to have children and grandchildren who exist today only because a priest decided that love mattered more than rules, that saving lives justified risking damnation, that sometimes the most Christian act is the one that makes the Church uncomfortable. Those descendants number in the hundreds now, scattered across Poland and Israel and the United States and a dozen other countries, each of them carrying forward a genetic and spiritual legacy that was purchased with opium-laced wine and a priest's courage. They are Father Max's true monument, more lasting than any statue or feast day could ever be, living proof that one person's decision to resist, even in the face of certain death, can echo forward through generations in ways that alter the very fabric of history. The Church may have tried to erase him, but biology and memory proved stronger than institutional forgetfulness. Every baby born into those families, every wedding and graduation and ordinary Tuesday afternoon they experience, is a defiant answer to the question of whether individual action matters against the machinery of genocide. Father Maksymilian Rakowski died in 1943, but his story refuses to stay dead because it speaks to something fundamental about human courage and institutional cowardice, about the gap between what we claim to believe and what we are willing to risk to live those beliefs. The Catholic Church teaches that Christ sacrificed himself to save humanity, but when one of their own priests did exactly that, used his body and his faith as weapons against evil, they could not bring themselves to celebrate him because his methods were too messy, too violent, too uncomfortable. It took 70 years and a historian's stubborn curiosity to drag his story back into the light, to force the Church to confront what it had tried to bury. And that delay, that decades-long erasure, is its own kind of testimony to how institutions protect themselves at the expense of the heroes who actually embody their stated values. Father Max's greatest enemy was not the Nazis who executed him, but the Church that abandoned his memory, because acknowledging him would have required acknowledging their own failures. Tonight, you know his name. You know what he did with poppies and wine and a prayer. You know that sometimes the most sacred act is the one that looks like heresy. And you know that history is full of ghosts waiting for someone to finally tell their story, waiting for the truth to emerge from beneath the floorboards where it has been hidden for far too long. Father Maksymilian Rakowski saved 47 lives and lost his own, and for 70 years the world pretended he never existed. Now you know better. Now you can make sure his ghost finally rests.